We just got some brand new spoilers from the upcoming Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms, man that's a mouthful, set. And I have to say, one of these cards is hilarious, and the other card is really flumped up.
Magic.
I am a wizard!
History.
I'm an old wizard!
The Magic Historian.
My bones hurt. Greetings! Owners of fine luxury cardboard rectangles. My friends, today I have the great joy of getting to talk about some of the upcoming cards from the new Dungeons & Dragons Adventures in the Forgotten Realms set. And I have to say, that set name is a massive mouthful, and I mess it up a fair number of times. So I imagine this spoiler season is going to be quite the challenge for me. Now, we have a few cards to talk about, and they are definitely fun ones. The first one is the one on the screen, and this is Flump. And I gotta say, all around, this is a fun concept. The name Flump is amazing. It's just such a silly, weird name, and it's actually based on the sound that these jellyfish make as they float around in the darkness. Flumps are a weird Dungeons & Dragons beast. You know what? Let's talk about the card and what it is, and we'll talk about what flumps are actually as well. So, the flump is 1 white and 1 for a 0/4 flying jellyfish with defender. So, it's got no offensive capabilities, which is a little bit weird because flumps do have some like acidic capabilities. They're not completely harmless, but they are mostly harmless. Anyways, the ability is whenever Flump is dealt damage, you and target opponent each draw a card. And the flavor text says, Flumps siphon thoughts and energy from evil aberrations and are often eager to share the dark knowledge they obtain with friendly adventurers. And this is a 0/4 flying jellyfish, so it can take a fair bit of abuse in terms of its toughness, right? And obviously that's to let you do some silly shenanigans where you can take advantage of the fact that you're drawing all these cards and you know your opponent's going to draw all these cards. But the Flump are basically a race of subterranean jellyfish. You'll find them in places like the Underdark, and they have basically like psychic level mind reading capabilities. So you can think of it along the lines of them having mind magic, where they can reach out into the thoughts of all the creatures that are nearby them. And in fact, if they encounter the thoughts of like truly evil beings, like really vile and dangerous thoughts, they turn red, which kind of works as like when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons and you're out and adventuring around and whatever, if you see them lighting up red, you go, boom, okay, there's probably enemies nearby. And if you get close enough to the Flump, it will actually share those specific thoughts with you, because flumps actually feed on the thoughts of everyone around, right? But the evil ones have the most impact, because not only does it cause the flump to light up, but the flump, it basically pushes its thoughts out of its own mind into other people's minds. So it draws these thoughts out of people, but then when it gets evil thoughts in its mind, it goes, no, I don't want to think evil thoughts, this is terrible. And it pushes them out into nearby creatures. In one way, kind of selfish. You know what I mean? Kind of horrific, right? Where you go, wait, what are you doing, Flump? Why are you inflicting this on other people? But from the perspective of adventurers, right? If you can be given these specific thoughts fed through the Flump, it can give you an advantage. You can end up going, oh, okay, you know what? I know who's around, what's going on. We can take advantage of this, and we can take this evil down. So the Flump float a few feet above the ground. They basically have air flowing through that hole that's there in the top of them and flowing out through them. And they make a very, very subtle flumpish kind of noise that you would only be able to hear if it was relatively silent. Think something along the lines of like the hum of an air conditioner in the background, but not a super powerful air conditioner, one that is like low level, or maybe a low level fan, whatever it is, it's the kind of background noise that you're mostly going to ignore unless nothing else is going on. You would hear this gentle sort of flumping if you had perfect quiet. And I gotta say, the flump is a really goofy looking being, right? The jellyfish with these crazy goobly little eye stalks coming up off of it. It's definitely a fun concept to bring into Magic the Gathering. And I have to say, in terms of the way that it works, the idea of flumps being able to like share thoughts is really well illustrated in the whole it lets everybody draw cards, right? It's sharing its thoughts out there. Knowledge gained, power gained. So that works overall. I mean, from a gameplay perspective, when you look at it, I don't know like how excited you're going to be to have this card most of the time. Because the card draw is symmetrical, you're only really going to want to play this in scenarios where you're primed to take advantage of it. This doesn't feel like something you would really want to use in a like draft style environment, something like that, because if your opponent's getting to draw a ton of cards off it as well as you, that you're not really getting that much ahead, are you, if at all, right? So for me, this is the kind of card that I actually tend to avoid most of the time, but you know, depending on the circumstances, you build a silly, goofy deck. If you're playing with cards that punish your opponent for having extra cards, or you have ways of shutting off their extra card draw, whatever, there are ways to make it asymmetrical, at which point it becomes, you know, a much better card. And in the artwork, you can see this flump is dealing with some kind of evil, angry, I'm going to say maybe, like, could be an orc, perhaps? It's got orcish kind of vibes to it, right? Pretty nasty. So the orc is basically like, well, bam, and smashing the flump, and the flump is like, bloop, have some thoughts, maybe? It just puts in the head, stop hurting me. Stop hurt. Don't hurt me anymore, my friend, please. Can't we just flump in peace? I will admit, I'm not sure what's going on in the foreground. If those are supposed to be feathers, I think they're supposed to be the ends of the tentacles of the flump, but they do kind of look on the end like feathers. So the flump, ultimately, I feel like this is a half-decent representation of a flump. You've got the concept of something that's not really offensive to begin with on its own. It's literally just a floating jellyfish. It's got the mind transferring feel to it. So overall, I'd say they did a pretty good job of encapsulating the Dungeons and Dragons creature type on this card. And I really, really have to say that so far, I've been absolutely loving seeing things from Dungeons and Dragons being brought to life on Magic cards. The execution so far has been fantastic. And the next card that we're going to look at as well is also fantastic. As I said, one of the cards today is hilarious, and that's this one right here. So this is Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Now, if you're a Dungeons and Dragons player, you are probably at least somewhat familiar with this spell, as it has survived through many different editions. I don't know about you guys. I don't know what your main edition of Dungeons and Dragons is if you're a D&D player, but for me, it was actually second edition. Second edition was like the pinnacle of my Dungeons and Dragons experience. I've played 3.5, I've played some other styles, but ultimately, and I don't know if it's just because I have the strongest and greatest memories attached to second edition, you know, like humans are a little bit averse to change. So when you come and try like a different variation, you may go, you know what? I like the one I was used to before. But Tasha's Hideous Laughter, back in my day, was a second level spell. But I did some looking around, and apparently nowadays, it's a first level spell. And I'll admit that it really isn't like that surprising that it's been downgraded to a first level spell, because Tasha's Hideous Laughter is a fun, silly, goofy kind of D&D spell that definitely has its uses, but ultimately doesn't feel nearly as intense as other magical spells, right? The ability to put your opponents to sleep, or the ability to set them on fire, hurl lightning at them, those tend to rank higher in terms of the concepts of what kind of magic do I want to be mastering. But Tasha's Hideous Laughter is definitely interesting. I loved the D&D spells that were like attributed to particular individuals, you know, like Bigby and like stuff like that. If you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. But anyways, Tasha's Hideous Laughter is 2 blue and 1 for a sorcery that says Each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until that player has exiled cards with total mana value 20 or more. So this is what I like to refer to as mill plus, because not only are you milling their deck, but you're literally removing everything that gets milled that way out of the game, which in most cases is going to be to your advantage. Unless you're playing a strategy where you literally want to feed on your opponent's graveyard, exiling their cards is strictly superior to milling their cards, because there's a number of ways that your opponent can interact with their own graveyard as well, depending on their strategies, right? Like, so if you're playing against a black deck, then they have reanimation effects. And even like green decks nowadays have the Troll King who comes back from sacking 3 food or whatever. So milling is good, but exiling is strictly better. And it's cool that it references the number 20, because 20 is the sacred number in D&D, because most of the time to resolve things, you're rolling a 20-sided die, and if you roll a 20, that's like critical success, right? That's your boom, I get to do extra damage, or boom, I used my skill in a super effective way, that sort of scenario. There are very few scenarios where a 20 is not going to be, yeah, woo, you know what I mean? So I like the fact that it references 20 mana value, and interestingly enough, right now, there are some decks floating around, and I'm thinking mainly like Mimi-style EDH decks, but there are commander decks right now that have like 96, 97 lands in them, right? So if somebody's playing that commander deck and you play this, like, you'll notice it says each opponent, so it's slanted towards commander in the first place. But if anybody's playing that meme deck, they're gonna lose, because those meme decks the total mana value of their entire deck is like 20 or less. So Tasha's Hideous Laughter becomes your whole deck is gone, which is funny, because if you think about this card in a normal game of Commander where somebody's not playing a meme deck, it's not really going to make too huge an impact overall, I would say, because Commander is a place where big expensive spells flourish, and most people's decks pack casting costs that you would never see in like a normal standard environment, right? An 8 casting cost spell in standard is probably never going to happen. You're never going to get there. The game's going to be decided before it happens, or your whole deck has to be like ramp, 8 cost. Whereas commander decks have big, crazy, swingy spells in them a lot of the time. You're not going to find too many commander decks where everything costs like 1 or 2. So ultimately, this is not going to do that much against most commander decks, but then against certain ones, it's just going to hammer them. And depending on the standard decks that you're playing against, this could do considerable amounts of mill, because standard has become very, very fast, which means like if you're playing anything that costs more than 5 mana, you're probably in trouble. Sure, you can get away with 6 casting costs if they have like discounts on the cost, like Ember Cleave or whatever, but I really do feel like once you go above 5 mana in standard, you're really getting into the danger zone. So this could eat a good chunk of a standard deck, depending on what you're facing off against. And if you're playing something like against a mono red rush, it's really just going to chew just right through the deck. So the idea behind Tasha's Hideous Laughter is it's a spell that literally causes the target to laugh, all right? It's uncontrollable hideous laughter. And if you think about it, you know what it's like, at least to a degree, at some point in your life probably, to have laughed too much. Either too many funny things are happening to the point where you're literally weeping, your face is red, and your sides start to ache, where you literally start begging, you're like, please, please stop. I'm physically in pain from this, right? So you know what it's like to laugh too much. Well, this is magically induced laughter of the most insane degree. So you end up with a scenario where it literally affects your brain. It just racks your mind with the insanity of it. Your brain is so consumed with all-encompassing laughter that all other thoughts are driven from your mind for a brief period of time, all right? The Hideous Laughter spell is a low-level spell. It doesn't last for a long time. That's why it doesn't get rid of the whole deck. But the idea of being able to cast a spell on another planeswalker, and it just starts with like a little bit of smirk, then a smile, and then they're just like chuckling, and then on to guffawing, and their face doesn't look like they're having a great time overall. Sure, their mouth is laughing, but there's this horror in their eyes where they realize they have absolutely no control over this. Imagine having a spell like this cast on you. It would be completely unexpected. As a planeswalker, normally you're used to, okay, they're trying to cast lightning bolts at me, or they're trying to do this. Like even mind mages that invade your mind, none of them would try and make you laugh. So maybe for the first few seconds when the spell took hold, you'd be like, oh, hey, this is all right. And then all of a sudden it just gets worse and worse. And you're like, oh man, when is this going to end? As it just tears through your mind. You're like, ah! But the whole time you're just cackling like a fiend. And the flavor behind the card from the perspective of the artwork in the flavor text. The flavor text says, the raging Behir reared back, opened its terrible maw, and collapsed in a fit of horrifying giggles. And you can see that's what's going on in the artwork here. You have what looks like a little halfling mage who is casting a spell on the Behir and has a really cool touch. You can actually see one of the spell components. When it comes to Dungeons and Dragons and casting spells, the mages use spell components. Not every spell has particular, like spells can have somatic, verbal, and material components. So somatic is making gestures, verbal is speaking, obviously, and the material components are actual physical objects that are required to cast the spell. So to cast Tasha's Hideous Laughter, you actually need to have a feather and really tiny little tarts, like miniature pies, that you throw at them. So when you go boom, boom, and you fire a tiny little tarts at them and waggle a feather at them, and they're like, what are you doing, bro? And they're like, and it just goes from there. Like, that's such a cool little touch. I just love that they went that extra mile, right? Because if you don't know about spell components, you might just think the Behir here is laughing just like, you stupid little mage. But it literally has no control. It's trying to hold its own sides with one of its many legs. It's a weird kind of like centipede crocodilian crossover beast. They are evil beasts that basically were created by storm giants to destroy dragons. That's the purpose. That's what Behirs are. So something that mighty, something that's designed with an innate hatred of dragons that goes out and slays them, sitting there helplessly laughing and like rolling back and forth is a really cool concept. I have to say, A1 for the execution on this. I am so excited about seeing what else the Dungeons & Dragons set has to offer. So, my friends, let me know what you think in the comments below. Big shout out to all my patrons. Thank you very much for supporting my channel. And I will see all of you, my friends, for the next video.